Welcome back to the Midnight Musings Podcast. This is episode 3. In this episode, we will be discussing what opioids are, a bit about the Sackler family, the controversy of Purdue Pharma, and how this is all tied to the ongoing opioid crisis in the States. 最近 IG 粉专上的最新的2篇贴文都在简述我们今天 podcast 内容里面会提到的详细内容，所以我建议各位可以先把我们2篇贴文都看完，再来听我们今天的 podcast 内容。But well, this is a little bit overdue, so let us jump straight into our topic for today. Let us begin by understanding what opioids, or opiates, actually are. Opioids are a class of drugs that include both natural and synthetic compounds, with multiple origins from various sources. As mentioned in our latest post, one of the natural sources, widely known by most, is from the opium poppy. Other synthetic or semi-synthetic opioids are created through synthetic manufacturing processes. As mentioned earlier, a particular fact that might be overlooked is that opioids encompass the natural as well as the synthetic. But if we refer to opiates, we are solely referring to natural opioids. And these natural opiates, are directly derived from opium. Now, regardless of the origin, whether it be natural or synthetic sources, all opioids share a core molecular structure and exert powerful effects on the human body and mind. So now, let us discuss the mechanism of action of opioids, particularly inside the human body. Opioids exert their effects by binding to specific receptors inside the nervous system, including the central and peripheral nervous systems, as well as the digestive tract and peripheral tissues. And before you ask, yes, opioids are natural compounds, and that is why we have opioid receptors inside our bodies. This goes the same for cannabis, as we also have cannabinoid receptors inside our body, but that will be a topic for another time of discussion. Now, these receptors, these opioid receptors, they sort of act like a lock and key system, attracting opioids and initiating a cascade of events. Well, upon binding to these receptors, opioids then stimulate neurotransmitters such as endorphins and enkephalins, leading to decreased pain perception, increased pleasure, and relaxation. Different types of opioid receptors control, various functions, including pain sensation, mood, movement, and the respiratory function. As we've just mentioned, opioids have different mechanisms of actions depending on where they are in the human body. It is these neurotransmitters that causes the change in mood and perception. Now that we've established the basic understanding of the mechanism of action of opioids in the human body, let us discuss the particular effects that it induces. First of all, based on what we have just learned about opioids, it is natural to assume that the effects of opioids are quite diverse and far-reaching. Apart from its prescriptive pharmaceutical use of pain relief, most opioids influence various physiological functions that go beyond such a preliminary target. In addition to the analgesic properties of opioids, they can also induce feelings of sedation, euphoria, and relaxation, which is why a lot of people get that high from abusing opioids. Apart from these, sort of beneficial side effects, there are also adverse effects, detrimental side effects, such as anxiety, vomiting, nausea, constipation, respiratory depression, and so on. Not to mention the high risk of developing an acute addiction to opioids, which is generally observed through prolonged use. Prolonged use of opioids leads to physical dependence leads to mental dependence, and by reinforcing this particular behavior and allowing the tolerance of the body to continuously build, it is inevitable that opioids, for example in the brain, the experience and interpretation of pain is greatly altered and distorted in a way that a person might still feel the pain, but albeit in a way that it does not bother him. As for opioids in the spinal cord, they block the transmission of pain messages between neurons so that they never reach the brain. Hence the result of analgesia, or a reduced and eliminated sense of pain. As for opioids in the digestive tract, opioids generally cause constipation, nausea, or vomiting. That's why if you have heard of cases of people overdosing on methadone or having too much oxys, they might get constipated. As for the different types of opioid receptors, well, we're not going to dive too deeply into these, as they are another world of their own. Well, but just to list them out, well, there are the delta, the kappa, the mu, and the nociceptin opioid receptors. And although these respective receptors attract different kinds of opioids, the general outcome is basically the same. Similar effects and inducing a system-wide reaction. And reflecting on the lock and key metaphor that we briefly mentioned earlier, the binding of opioids to these respective receptors activate and trigger the release of neurotransmitters, just like what we mentioned earlier, endorphins, enkephalins, while also dynorphins, endomorphins, and such are highly addictive to the human mind and body. Also, the body's natural opioid production may decrease in response to supraphysiological opioids, which further exacerbates the risk of addiction. This is why, despite the therapeutic benefits of opioids, many medical professionals still caution greatly regarding the significant risks and potential challenges opioids pose in specific regard to pain management and addiction. On a side note, while it is true that the endogenous opioid mechanism of action does happen inside our bodies naturally, the effects of our natural endogenous opioids are not as strong as their supraphysiological counterparts. That is why when someone takes a prescribed opiate painkiller or some kind of illegal drug like heroin, the opioid receptors in our body go into overdrive, and the effects induced are way more intense than in a natural setting. While we did mention prolonged use, but it actually doesn't take too long at all for the natural production of opioids in our body to stop and begin to rely on outside sources. This is a very common effect when people take exogenous supraphysiological doses of particular hormones or compounds, which is the same for TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. And we will talk about that in another video as well. But anyways, in a nutshell regarding addiction, opioids hijack the body's opioid receptor system in a way that leaves the brain and the body needing for more. And it is because of the opioid's mechanism of action in the human body that causes the risk of addiction to become exponentially high. So now, apart from understanding what opioids are and their mechanism of action in the human body, we also have an understanding of the effects that they induce, both the positive and the negative. Let us finish off by throwing out a few names of some common opioids and opiates. Just as a reminder, opiates are naturally occurring opioids derived from natural sources. Some common opiates are morphine, codeine, opium, and thebaine. I believe most of these you've heard of before. Now, let's talk about some of the common opioids. Opioids are generally created by people, whether it be by combining parts of the opium plant to man-made ingredients or compounds, or entirely created or synthesized from scratch. Some of the common synthetic or semi-synthetic opioids are oxycodone, OxyContin, Demerol, Percocet, Percodan, fentanyl, heroin, and methadone. Now, if you have been listening to the news, or if you have a basic understanding of some of the illegal or potent drugs that have been circulating around the market for some time and have made quite a notorious name for themselves, then you would most certainly have heard of most of them. Now, if you're interested in the chemical structure of opioids and the specific cascade of chemical reactions that are triggered through the binding of opioids to respective opioid receptors in the human body, I strongly urge you to conduct your own research into this particular topic. And for those in the professional field, or for those who have personal experiences regarding opioid use and abuse, please leave your experiences and comments down below so that people like us can understand more about them. Sadly, a further dive into this topic would be out of my expertise, so this is as much as we will be talking about opioids and opiates today. In our next episode, we will talk more about the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma, how it fueled the opioid crisis and caused various phenomena like opium dens, illegal dealing of opiates, addiction problems, and the Opium Express. 在我们结束之前呢，这个 Opioid Crisis 跟 Sackler Family 的内容是我们 Midnight Musings Podcast 的 Next Episode 的内容。最后来做个结语， 除了看我们的 Sackler Family Opioid Crisis 的贴文之外，我非常建议各位去看 Painkiller The Painkiller TV Miniseries。影集里面的内容就是在讲述 the birth of the opioid crisis, the Sackler family, and specific emphasis on Purdue Pharma and its wrongdoings. You can find it on Netflix. 想看的话，可以去 Netflix 上面去查看看。Well, that's it for today. I hope all of you learned something about opioids and the potential dangers and harm they can cause. 最后想跟大家呼吁一下，虽然 the dose makes the poison, 但是像 opioids 这一种高度成瘾性质又具有特定潜在危险因素的化合物，还是不碰为妙。Stay away from drugs. Well, stay away from detrimental drugs, people. That's it for today. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Nathan out.